This is Love Your Work. On this show, we help you make it as a creative entrepreneur, find your unique voice, find the right mindset to succeed, and be the first to capitalize on new opportunities to make a living making your art. I'm David Cadavy. If you want to join us here on Love Your Work every Thursday, please hit subscribe on your podcast app. And to get your free creative productivity toolkit, sign up at cadavy.net/tools. When I was just getting finished writing my first book, Design for Hackers, I became very mystified with what was going on in my own brain. I wanted to know why it was that creativity is so hard sometimes, and then other times it's so easy. So why was I banging my head against the wall 12 hours a day, only to get 15 minutes of that flow where I was suddenly able to produce an entire day's worth of writing? And so that's when I picked up the book, Your Brain at Work. And Your Brain at Work changed my work forever. It served as a handbook for my brain, and I learned to think about the strengths and the limitations of my brain and the different categories of thought that there were and what mental and emotional states would make creative work come easily. And so I'm very glad today to have Dr. David Rock on the show. He is the author of Your Brain at Work. He's also the founder of the NeuroLeadership Institute, and they use a science-based approach to growing soft skills. They work with companies such as Intel, Microsoft, and IBM. Today, what you're going to learn about is, 1, what are level 1, 2, and 3 tasks in terms of your brain's horsepower, and how can you manage your day by these categories, by these levels to work more efficiently? 2, what is the concept of Construal, and how can you use this concept of Construal to help you work more quickly and with more clarity? And 3, what are the 4 keys to creating the conditions for insight? So if you can set up your work so that you're consistently creating these conditions, you're going to think a lot more creatively. Creative work is going to come a lot more easily. You can pick up Your Brain at Work at cadavy.net/brain at work. I highly recommend you do so. Here is Dr. David Rock. All right, I'm so thrilled to be talking to David Rock today. David, welcome to the show, first of all.
Thanks very much, David. Good to be here.
The reason I'm so excited to have you is that, as I said before the show, your book, Your Brain at Work, really changed my life. The reason being that I had just written a book and I was an inexperienced author, and I went through this experience of banging my head against the wall 12 hours a day just to get like 15 minutes of flow. And every once in a while, I would have that flow and I would suddenly be able to get my entire day's word output in a very short amount of time. And so when the smoke cleared on that process, I started to wonder, like, well, wait, hey, what was going on in my brain? How could I learn more about that? And how could I use that knowledge to make it so that in the future, when I do creative work, I'm not driving myself entirely crazy? So Your Brain at Work for me has become my sort of owner's manual for the brain that has helped me I couldn't even tell you how much it has helped me in optimizing my own creative thinking. So that's what I'd love to talk about today. Yeah, and I guess to start off, how does creative thinking, is that different from other types of thinking? How does it compare to other types of thinking that a person might do in their everyday work?
Yeah, no, it's really different. I mean, I set out to write Your Brain at Work to improve all kinds of thinking, just to help people think better overall. But I guess I had an unconscious bias that I'm a bit of a creative, and a lot of my work is creative thinking, and so I guess I accidentally wrote a book about good creative thinking, which definitely is different. But there are certainly some common skills and common kind of approaches that you need to more linear work as well as more creative work. But the difference is, I mean, the bottom line is creative work involves having as much access as you can to your unconscious brain, and really being able to make not just make deep connections between, huge amounts of information, but to hear those connections and to see those connections and to feel those connections. So a lot of it comes down to your ability to notice these, what are called quiet signals in the brain. We need to be able to notice quiet signals, to be creative. And so, anything that helps you kind of quiet your brain helps a lot. And so there's a lot around that. But essentially, linear thinking is more about focusing and kind of chunking and grouping, and more creative thinking is actually more about, making connections, and it has to happen in the deeper regions of your brain. You can't make those connections consciously. You actually need the unconscious to do the work. So it's all about those moments of insight, those aha moments.
So it sounds like kind of the opposite of creative thinking would be, as you're calling it, linear thinking, right? What would be like an example of, the opposite of creative thinking to you?
There's actually two kinds of functions that the brain can do when it gets data. It can kind of break that data apart, or it can link that data to other data. So there's, if you think of a horizontal axis for a minute, it's nice to draw this, or you can imagine it in your mind's eye. But on the left, you've got kind of breaking data into its component parts, and on the right, you've got connecting data to other data. And so there are always these two processes. So and this is actually at a very, very like basic level, at a very fundamental level in terms of what neurons do with information. Linear is generally like taking an idea and kind of breaking it apart. So you've got a project to deliver in 3 months for $100,000. And now you've got to work out how. And so you're writing a document to basically work out how to achieve that goal. So you're actually breaking that goal down, right? You're saying, all right, what do I do month 1? What do I do month 2? So you're thinking about it temporally. Then maybe you're thinking about it in terms of people. Maybe you're thinking about it in terms of money. But at each point, you're basically breaking down this meta goal into subparts. And you're building this kind of whole architecture of thoughts that kind of all flows up into this big goal. But it's very linear. It's very logical, right? And you basically can do one thing after the next. And, you know when you're halfway through, you know what you need to do next. It's logical. Whereas the creative work isn't like that. The creative work is like, I've got to invent a new project for the next 3 months. And I have no idea what project that is. And you kind of scan through all the past work you've done, and you maybe look at your colleagues' work and you read a bunch of things online, and then you take a nap, and then you wake up. And just as you're waking up, you have this big idea that comes to you. And you suddenly go, oh, I want to work on, building a new blog or whatever it is. And you have this big idea, and it feels like it comes from nowhere. There's a really clear science of how it happens. I've been studying this actually for the longest time of all my research. I've been obsessed about the neuroscience of insight for about 15 years. But that process is not breaking things down. It's actually linking things together. So your brain in a deep way, like links your goal with like all the other projects you've done before, with like trends that you're noticing, with like other projects you're seeing people do, with like just random ideas you've just seen. And it creates this massive web, and suddenly this new idea forms out of it. So at a very fundamental level, you're either breaking information apart or you're putting it together. And creative work tends to be about putting things together in novel ways. I think it's an interesting foundation to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes me realize that that's probably from Your Brain at Work that I discovered the work of John Kunyos and Mark Beeman.
Yeah.
Kunyos was on the podcast way back a couple of years ago to talk about the nature of insight. And that's something that I've been talking about a lot on this podcast and have been obsessed with myself. And I mean, it seems like to make these connections, you actually have to have knowledge to connect. So I guess the way that I think about creative thinking is getting the knowledge into my brain and then allowing that incubation to happen and then trying to create the conditions for that insight to occur. Is that a generally accurate way of thinking about it? Do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. But there are more efficient and powerful ways of doing each of those stages that works much better than others. Like the sort of putting information into your head stage, that's better done over time in small bites. And the more you can kind of summarize the ideas into the gist of them, the easier it is for your brain to make connections between things. So kind of taking in information but creating summaries so your brain can link the gists is good. Sleeping on something after you've digested it is great because your brain actually kind of strips away the data and focuses on the gist, kind of on the central point. And there's some good research showing that operation really helps with insight of kind of stripping things away and focusing on the gist, the kind of central point. So at the putting information in stage, we want to focus more on the gist versus sort of every bit of data. The stage where you're reflecting, you talk about creating the right conditions for insight. That's where I probably spent most of my research life in the last 20 years, is on that one question. Kind of what is the mental state, the ideal mental state for insight? And it came from work by Kulias and Beeman, who I had spent some time with, particularly Beeman, a while back now, 15 years ago. But it came from an insight I had, which was that basically insight is really quiet. Insights are quiet signals that actually happen all the time, but we just don't hear them. And anytime we plug a question into our brain, the deeper regions start working. And these deeper regions are working all the time on lots of different things, but we just don't hear the insights, basically because they're too quiet. And, a good metaphor is like an insight is a quiet cell phone at a loud party. And you've got to turn down the party to find the phone. And the way to think about that is you've got every memory of every problem you've solved and every book and every podcast and every, conversation of meaning, like all that stuff stored in your brain, but often we don't use these ideas again. So they get the networks holding that information. Say like, let's say you've read, Good to Great, 20 years ago. Jim Collins, big book, Good to Great. There's a bunch of ideas in there. They're in your head, but you probably can't even remember the ideas. You probably can't even remember the concept of, get the right people on the bus if you were asked to, label what was in his book. But actually it's all in there. And if you read that book and focus on it, that concept's in there. But when you read it, there are maybe 100 million or billion neurons in the network for that idea. And because you haven't used it, now there's like 50 neurons holding that idea. So what you don't use, it gets recycled. And essentially, the electrical activity of a network correlates to how many neurons are in that network. So the electrical spike of, I hope I'm not getting too technical for you, but the electrical spike of the idea of get the right people on the bus is only like 50 neurons high. And you've got billions of ideas that you just haven't drawn on much that are held in small networks of neurons like this idea.
Well, and then on top of it, there's electrical activity happening in your brain just from being conscious.
Well, yeah. I mean, every neuron, you've got roughly 100 billion neurons. They're all spiking 12 times a second at rest, doing nothing. And so it's just a lot of activity. And, baseline electrical activity in the brain is really loud. So anyway, you've got these, you basically, ask this creative question, like what project should I work on next? And your brain starts searching. And you basically start this giant search through like every book you've read, every idea you've had, all this stuff. But, and what your brain does is start to put these things together. It finds patterns and links, one idea with another idea with another idea. But the electrical activity of these links, again, is just small. And we just don't notice those connections. And by the way, people who notice those connections well, are often on, a spectrum of schizophrenia or other things where they kind of notice too many connections. making too many connections. So it's not a bad thing that we, don't notice every connection we could make. We would go a bit nuts, in a sense, with respect to mental health issues. But anyway, cut a long story short. So insight involves like asking a question, your brain doing this deep search, and then, your unconscious or non-conscious regions linking to stuff that you've learned already. And we've probably solved every problem we're ever going to run up against. Or we could put together two solutions. As an adult, we don't need a lot of new solutioning, a lot of new content stuff. We need to be able to access what we have better. And as Beeman says, anything that helps you notice quiet signals dramatically increases the likelihood of insight. And then I codified that into kind of 4 things to focus on, which I can talk about. But that's the foundational principle is your brain's, the deeper regions of your brain are quiet. They matter a lot and we need them. And when I say the deeper regions, like the metaphor I use a lot, the conscious brain you can think of as being about a cubic foot, and the unconscious with all this stuff stored in it is about the Milky Way by comparison. And the Milky Way is really quiet compared to the cubic foot, that's right here. So there's a lot there, and the more we can quiet, the more we can find those things.
Right. And as you're talking about this, I can vaguely sort of feel it happening in my own brain. I read your brain at work, something like 8 years ago, 7 years ago. I've been taking notes in preparation for our conversation. I've reviewed everything and reviewed my highlights before our conversation, just to kind of prime my brain and maybe activate those, I think you would call them maps or little networks of these concepts. But then also, as you're talking, as I'm listening, as I'm thinking about the next thing to ask you, you're also, I guess, causing electrical activity in these maps that are reawakening, where I'm thinking, oh, that's right, I remember thinking about that. That reminds me of this question, and that reminds me of this question. Is that kind of what's going on?
Exactly.
There?
Little insights happening as you make connections. That's great. Yeah, you're spot on.
Okay, and so just simply having those ideas, we need to have that information go into our brains and learn that information. As you said, the conscious mind is like a cubic foot. The unconscious mind is like the Milky Way. I mean, that makes me think about this idea that our working memory can only hold so many objects in it. It's like if you were, if you're gonna come up with some sort of creative solution, and you can only hold 4 or 7 things in your working memory that are new concepts, well, that makes it pretty hard to come up with a creative solution. Whereas if you have these things stocked in your long-term memory, then it becomes a little bit easier. Is that an accurate way of thinking about coming up with great insights?
Yeah. You want to have a lot of information accessible in long-term memory, and have your brain kind of sort through it without you having to work on it consciously. David Creswell, who at the time was at Carnegie Mellon, did a really interesting study on this. He got people to in the lab to make a complex decision that had like 4 variables, and 4 variables is a lot of variables. It might have been 4 or 5, I can't remember, but it's a lot of variables. Like I think it was a car decision, like price and size and color and a bunch of other stuff. And what you find is that when you have like more than 1 or 2 variables, it's just too much for your conscious brain to actually sort through options. If you're looking at 10 car options, you got 4 variables, you just can't work it out. And what he found was, he created 3 conditions: people that just had to guess on the right, on what the right answer was. People who were, essentially, and then people who were given a distracted task. They were like, so they were sort of given the information, then given a distracted task, and their unconscious brain was able to do some work on it and then guess. And there's a third group who were like given some time to try and work on it in a logical way. And what he found is that in the second and third category, people's deeper brain regions definitely get to work, like sorting through the problem. And you can actually see in fMRI, a whole interesting set of brain regions, involved in deep connections and long-term memory, animating and kind of, you imagine them sort of filing through all these ideas. But the people who were given a distracted task and then told to guess, they did dramatically better at optimizing their decision. And what happens is that the processing power of the Milky Way is much bigger than the processing power of the cubic foot. That's what was able to happen. So I think, we need to be able to tap into that and, putting things into working memory into long-term memory, is difficult. We got to make things simple for them to get into the long-term memory. We have to work within the capacity limits of the brain. We've got tremendous capacity limits for how much we can think about at once and how much we can hold at once and how much we can calculate at once. So as we put stuff into our working memory, we need to kind of simplify it. I did it again, long-term memory. As we put stuff into long-term memory, we need to simplify it and make it digestible. And that'll help us access it later as well.
Right. And so, with all this knowledge that you have about this, are there things that you personally do to help you do that learning, to help you manage your mental resources so that you get that stuff into your long-term memory where you can use it to make good insights?
I mean, I'm aware of the limitations of my brain a lot, particularly working memory. So, when I think back to writing your brain at work, which is a while ago now, but one of the lessons I learned is for me personally, I could write really well in the morning if it's first thing, before I checked my emails, and early in the week, or after a vacation, or after a good nap, or after some exercise. I could write really well for like an hour at the most, maybe 2 hours, and if it's really after a good break. But then I would just be overwhelmed. And what I started to do was like protecting those times when I would actually write well, and trying to get 10 to 20 hours a week of actually, really clear headspace. And it's really hard to do, really hard to protect it. I'd have to get up early. I'd have to, take weekends. I'd have to take time off work and kind of just do this. And even then I'd only do a few good hours a day. And, but if I was working, I just wouldn't even get that. And so I just kind of respected the limits of my brain. And, even now, if I need to write, I need to kind of shut everything off, switch off the internet and really go quiet. And I know the best way to write well is, do some laps in the pool, don't think about anything. And then an idea will come to me and I'll have tons of energy to write, and I'll write like crazy for an hour and then I'll be done. And or go for a run or take a nap or just, something that really quiets my brain. Then stuff comes to me. I have an idea and I get to writing. So I've just learned to respect that kind of pattern rather than trying to push myself. And I end up doing a lot better work.
I mean, what I love in particular about that is that you said that you found that you wrote better earlier in the week. And that's exactly the way, thanks to much of what I learned in Your Brain at Work, that I manage my own writing, is that my early in the week is heavily weighted for heavy lifting and creative work, maybe prioritization sessions on a Monday afternoon. And then as the week wears on, by like Friday afternoon, that's when I'm going to look at if my accountant sends me an email and I need to review some financial statements or something, that's when I'm going to do that stuff because, I don't need my best energy to actually do that. But when you talk about writing and going for a swim or things like that, did you ever find in your process of writing some granularity in identifying the different categories of thinking that are happening as you're writing?
Yeah, for sure.
Make any distinguishing changes based upon that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, let me go back to something you just said before as well. So one of the things I distinguished, and I think it's in Your Brain at Work, but there's 3 levels of thinking. And I keep this really simple for obvious reasons, but level 1 thinking is like deleting emails. It's something that takes seconds and very little working memory. Level 2 thinking takes like maybe 30 seconds to a minute of working memory. Takes a little bit of effort, and that's like scheduling a meeting. You've got to think about, your schedule, think about their schedule, come up with something, send an email. So scheduling a meeting is like a level 2 task. And a level 3 task is creative work, or really difficult conceptual work, like framing up a spreadsheet or analyzing a lot of data. Or so level 3 work is the really difficult work. And what people tend to do is start their day with level 1 work, deleting emails and just quick stuff. Then they do all the level 2 work of sort of scheduling and managing things. And, each task takes 30 seconds. And by the time they get to level 3 work, their brain's really noisy because everything you've just done up to now has tired your brain, but also put a lot of data and literally noise into midterm working memory, the stuff held just kind of behind working memory. And so when you get to do the hard stuff where you want the quiet brain, you've already made it noisy. And it's a long way of saying do creative work first, urgent and important work second, and email and scheduling and everything else third. So do your level 3 work first before you do anything at all, and you'll be much, much better at it. And definitely first thing in the morning for everyone, even night owls, because the brain is rested. Whatever time you get up, after a sleep, maybe not straight away. Some people are different there. But soon after a sleep is definitely the quietest in the brain, and you tend to do the most efficient and effective creative work and linear work. But in particular, you'll see the impact on creative work. So it's kind of how do you protect that time? So that's one framework that I used. The other thing that I noticed, and this actually wasn't my idea, it came from some writing classes I did years ago with a writer named Roland Fishman in Australia. But one thing I noticed is a really different cognitive process involved in in actually sitting down and writing, like pouring stuff out, where you're getting in flow and you just got ideas flowing, you're writing. There's a really different process between that and editing, where you're reading stuff and making changes. And one of the best bits of advice I ever got from Roland Fishman, and I'll explain the science of it in a minute, was a really hard discipline, and almost everyone can't do it. It takes real discipline to do it, but it's separate writing from editing. Like just keep writing until you're done, and don't edit it at all. Don't stop. Don't pause. Just keep going. Just keep writing. Now, whether that's 2 minutes, 5 minutes, an hour, or 2 days, just keep writing. Don't edit. And then at some point stop, and now you can edit. It's a whole different process. And editing you can tend to do with fewer resources. It's easier to do with a noisy brain. Writing is much harder. And so, write first and then edit. And just, sometimes you got to read a bunch of stuff just to kind of get to where you are and let your writing juices kick in. But again, don't edit. Just read it lightly, high level. Don't let your brain get too noisy, and put in effort, and then just let yourself start writing. And what's happening here is writing is very abstract. It's conceptual, and you're sort of thinking stuff and making connections, and then, pouring that through your fingers. Editing is much more linear. And again, with editing, it's much more of that left-hand side, of that axis where you're breaking things down and, looking for errors. It's not so much connective, whereas writing's more abstract. Editing's more concrete. And as soon as you start shifting from abstract to concrete, you reduce the creative process. And so you want to stay in that abstract high level thinking as long as you can, while you're writing or conceptualizing, and let that abstract flow happen, and then get into the concrete stuff at a later stage. So abstract first, concrete second. So that's definitely something that I've played with a lot.
We're going to take a quick break. Hey, it's really cool. We have the University of California, Irvine's Division of Continuing Education, sponsoring the show. UC Irvine, they're ranked in the top 10 of public universities in the U.S., and their Division of Continuing Education has been offering education to adult learners in Orange County since 1962, but you don't have to be in Orange County to get educated. At UCI, their online courses offer flexibility and a real immersive online classroom experience because you get to collaborate with your peers. Whatever you want to study, you can do it on your own time and advance your career in as little as 6 months. And UCI's Division of Continuing Education wants you to know spring quarter is coming up. Registration's open right now. So right now, visit ce.uci.edu/podcast. Enter the promo code podcast for 15% off one course. That's ce.uci.edu/podcast, and enter the word podcast for 15% off one course. This offer is valid through March 31st. That's coming up, so hurry. Yeah, that's something that I've found as well. And I even divide it up a little bit further to where, yes, there's the writing, I call it generation in the framework that that I've been talking about a bit on the show. And then if I come across something that I'm not quite sure about, or where I think there's some information that needs to be researched, I'll just put it in brackets. And then researching itself becomes its own separate task, researching these points that are in the brackets, because really to connect all these ideas, they need to be in your brain somehow. And so that's something that I have found to be its own thing. It's different when you're writing about something that you already know everything about,
right?
Because the information is already in your brain.
Researching's different work again. You're right, absolutely. The other kind of work that's different, because I think there's writing work, there's editing work, there's research work, there's also structuring. And when I wrote Your Brain at Work, my head was really hurting at one point because there were all these layers in the book. There's the layer of like, it's one day. So you sort of the temporal thing across the day. There's a layer of these like characters interacting, over that day. There was a layer of, the scientists actually presenting science. There's a layer of a before and after, because each chapter has like a before and after, the science. There was a layer of kind of a whole section of the book on one type of brain issue, and another section, another type of brain issue. Then there was a layer of these scenes and acts that I created. And then there was the layer of kind of the chapters building on each other and adding to each other. And I was putting it all together and it was driving me like really batty, like trying to hold it all. And at one point I just said, look, I actually need to like develop literally articulate everything I just said and map it out like on a spreadsheet with exactly what's happening, when and why and how, and kind of see it. And I spent like 2 days doing that at one point. And once I'd done that, I could kind of get back to work and have it make sense. And so that's, think of that as structuring. You're working on the overall structure of the work, and looking at alternative structures, have I got it right? And all that's different type of thinking again.
Absolutely. And actually, I keep mentioning this sort of framework that I work with, where I have mental states that I've categorized my creative work into, and I divide my tasks up according to those mental states. And what you're describing, the structure, I really just put that, and you can tell me whether this makes sense or not, I'd really just put that into the category that I got from Your Brain at Work, which is that of prioritization. Do those seem like related concepts to you, the idea of an outline or structure of a book and what you think of as prioritization in the brain?
Yeah, it is prioritization. It's a little more than that though also. So there's a concept I've been working with since the book. It's not in the book. It's about construal level. And construal is a funny word, Construal. And there's been a lot of research on it. And essentially it's about the level at which you're thinking. So there's that famous story about the janitor at NASA who was asked, what he does for a living. He says, I help put man on the moon. And he had very high construal, really low construal would be, I move my arms. Higher construal would be, I sweep dirt. Higher construal would be, I keep things clean. Higher construal again would be, I maintain safety. The highest construal was, I put man on the moon. And
so how many levels between the action that you're taking and the meaning of it? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, high construal is more about meaning. So as you're going up, it's kind of greater meaning.
Okay.
And when you think about structure of a story, we want to be able to have all the different levels of construal worked out. Like, what's the meta story? What's your thesis in 25 words or less? That's the highest construal. For me, it really helps to understand your brain. That was my thesis, right?
But that's something I do when I write very often is I'll find myself, okay, well, I've been working on this book. I just want to write one sentence. What is this book about? Okay, now let's write one paragraph. What is this book about? And then, doing that for the chapters and everything. Is that kind of...
That's kind of it, yeah.
Related to this?
And what we've seen from research, and we published, at my institute, we published more on this, what we've seen is that the clearer you are about the really highest construal, the easier it is to work the next levels down. So when you've got the top level of construal really clear, you're much more creative and flexible and adaptive and, able to work around problems and see really good creative solutions. So you want to get that really high construal. And so basically it's a way of saying you want really a lot of clarity on your architecture. Like, what's the story about in 25 words or less? What's the paragraph? And then what's the kind of, and then what's the architecture that you're working with as well? So, that's really important. It's a different type of thinking, but it's very helpful. And what happens is, because we don't have much working memory, when we're able to look at the structure of a story like that, we're able to see the disconnects and the problems and the challenges. And one of the things I like to do, I have a team of writers now at my institute. One of the things that we'll often do is, as we're thinking about a story or a piece, is we'll look at the architecture alone without all the details. And then we'll create 2 other architectures and say, that's option A. Let's look at option B and option C for just the overall architecture at thumbnail. And then one will jump out like, oh, okay, option C is a much better overall architecture. And then we'll get back to work. So when something's not working, you kind of lift up to more abstract and more simple summaries of, at higher construal, and then you're able to get back to work quite often.
And so are prioritization and construal mutually exclusive? Do they overlap? Can you compare and contrast them a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, prioritization, construal is about meaning and purpose. High construal is about meaning and purpose. Low construal is about, actions you need to take. And so prioritization in a sense is just, what really matters. What should you do first? What should you do second?
So maybe it's the construal guides the prioritization.
Yeah, construal.
Is that kind of it? Like, I have this meaning, and then these are the actions in their order of priority that will help me meet that meaning.
That's a good way to think about it. That's a good way to think about it. And remember that we can't hold very much in the brain. So when you look at a list of like 6 tasks to do, your brain just explodes. But if you can prioritize them and go, oh, actually, here's the order, and now I know I just need to focus on doing number 1. Now your working memory, stops exploding, and you can start thinking again about option 1. And so prioritizing is just all about dealing with really limited working memory, and knowing where to start, which helps you get your working memory back from the brink of overwhelm. And so prioritizing is quite cognitively taxing, as I talk about it in Your Brain at Work. It's really cognitively taxing because you're holding all the information all at once and trying to see patterns. So it helps to do it again with a quiet mind. It helps to prioritizing. It helps to do it when you've got a quiet mind, and be able to see the patterns easiest, and then get to work. So,
and mental energy, right?
Yeah, so, that's right.
I mean, that's why Sunday evenings is about the time after a weekend of doing some relaxing. That's the time that I do my weekly review and plan things. I really take the time to prioritize and think through everything that's on my calendar. What am I not thinking of? What are things that I can do right now that'll make it easier when this meeting comes around or whatever? And then also, if I'm really looking for a new direction in my business, that's when I'll, go to a cafe on a Monday afternoon with a notebook and just really think about everything that's going on and try to reorient my priorities. Does that sound about like a decent way to manage one's energy around prioritization?
Yeah, you're on track. It sounds like it's working for you.
And you were talking earlier about, I guess, comparing things. It makes me think about somebody who I've spoken to on the podcast earlier, Tynan, who listeners are familiar with, who talks about following kind of crazy ideas and how sometimes people, maybe they have a fantasy, they want to do some unusual or wild project, but they end up concentrating on kind of one thing that actually what happens is that they have various factors that they're thinking about. If you were to ask them the reason why they're afraid to take on this project or go on this adventure or something like that, and then they don't really end up taking the time to think through all of those things. They kind of get overwhelmed and just decide, well, I just am not going to be able to do that. And so what he likes to do is just say, okay, well, I'm going to identify one deciding factor about whether I'm going to do this or not. And then that helps manage his energy on deciding whether or not to do something. That's just a thought that I have. I don't know if that makes you think of anything about how to manage this I guess it is keeping your brain from getting overwhelmed when there's a lot of complexity and being able to see the actual factors that should be dictating your decisions.
Yeah, and then not just go with a bias, which is what happens. I mean, I outlined a process in my earlier book, Quiet Leadership, that I think it hasn't had enough focus, and I probably should come back to it. But it's just called the CREATE model, and it's a way of kind of structuring and stepping out your thinking in 3 stages. And it starts with the current reality, like just start with, what do you know now, and what about your situation or your goal or your project, without trying to explore options or anything. And just kind of immerse in the facts, right? The current reality. The second stage is explore alternatives. So it's CREA, explore alternatives. And that's where you actually go, hey, what are the 2 or 3 or 5 different pathways I could take here, without valuing them? Just lay them out and don't collapse too early. And then the third is thoughtfully evaluate. So, once you've got the options, thoughtfully evaluate them, based on maybe 1 criteria or 2 criteria or more if you're going to use a spreadsheet. So, what's the current reality? What are the options? And how you're going to evaluate them? It sounds really logical, but and sort of obvious, but people don't do it. And when you do it, you come up with much better answers, because you're kind of doing, one process at a time really well. And that's something I use, with my team. We'll use that a lot. We use that with consulting projects externally as well. It's just a way of moving through like really complex, difficult decisions and thinking, in a way that helps everyone's brain hurt less and be more productive.
Well, there seems to be a theme here of being comfortable with not trying to arrive at a decision right away. I mean, even it goes back to the problem that I was having when I was first trying to write my book, was that I thought that I could sit down and just write, and that would be that. Oh, just write 250 words a day and you'll be done. But there's really a lot of preparation to have happen. And a good way to make that happen is to, as you're describing with this, I think, focus your attention in a certain category of thought, explore that category of thought, give yourself time between that session and some later session where maybe you explore a different category of thought related to that. Is that essentially the way that you're thinking about this?
Yeah. And when you come back to thinking, you see things fresh. You have what I call the clarity of distance. It's wonderful to let your brain rest and come back to things. You see things fresh. I did an experiment with this for years. It's really fun. I'd on my phone, I'd play with one of those games where you're trying to find the most possible words with, say, 9 letters or something. Do you know those apps where you
like Boggle?
Yeah. And you, but I like the ones where you're not timed and you can kind of keep coming back to them. And what I find is I'll feel like I've seen everything possible, and we'll have spent half an hour or something on it. And I'm guaranteed that if I put it down for 5 minutes and look at it fresh, I'll see new words. And then I'll run out, and then I'll put it down and I'll see it fresh again, and I'll see new words again. And this is the power of the unconscious, right? Versus the conscious. This is the unconscious making connections. But I have to kind of quiet my brain to see them. But literally just like coming back to something. And if it's overnight, I'll see even more. But literally like coming back to things, even the simplest things, you see completely different data and you make completely different connections. And it's so powerful to let your brain kind of, go off and come back. You end up being much smarter overall.
And in this, we're talking about maybe focusing on something. This reminds me a little bit of, I live in Colombia, and to learn Spanish, one of the things I would do is I would watch the same 20-minute clip of a movie every morning along with breakfast. Now, I didn't make myself pay attention to it, but I just made sure that it was playing. And then eventually what happened was I started to develop these different sound clips that were in my brain that then I could use as a grab bag throughout my day as I was trying to decide how to say something. Well, in this movie, they say that because I have that sound clip in my brain, and I can connect it to this current situation. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, how things get programmed into our brains even when we aren't focusing on those things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a specific scenario. With language, we need to build phonemes to be able to speak. Phonemes is a unit of sound. Like, I'm Australian and originally, and I live here now, but in New York. But my name is David Rock, and Americans can't hear that sound. They can't. There's no "ock," right? It's like they think it's ROQUE or something. There's just no sound like that in the American language, and so I have to say rock, or they just look at me strange. And sometimes they literally won't hear me when I say rock. And there's a whole lot of research on that from language research and we build language from these building blocks of phonemes, and each language has some slightly different phonemes. Si je commence à parler en français, c'est difficile pour parler pour moi, mais c'est possible. And as I start speaking French, I'm activating really different phonemes, for like chunks of words. And if you don't have those phonemes, you don't have building blocks to draw on. And as you build them, you can kind of pull and use them. And so a lot of writing is about developing, or installing in your brain the chunks you need to now build with, like phonemes. Whether it's a language or something else.
I mean, if I think about writing, I can't help but wonder if there's also kind of another level of abstraction here where when it comes to writing, it might be a sentence structure thing where I tend to write sentences that have this structure. I tend to write paragraphs that have this structure. And there's something going on there as well. Are those, I guess it's maybe difficult to know if those two things are related.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a lot of stuff happening unconsciously. Do you write like really directly, describing things, directly like in classic style, or do you write more, in the third person? Do you write long sentences? Do you write short sentences? Are you changing it up? There's a lot of different stuff to think about. My own approach is try to have an insight, try to have something I'm energized by. And when we have these insights, we have a lot of energy that's very natural, that kind of wants to come out of us. So I'm always interested in, how do I have the insight, to get past the impasse that I'm at? So, writing's about getting from impasse to insight. And then can I quickly sit down and start writing it? And the insight has a ton of energy in it, I find, for a few hours. So that's kind of how I approach it. And then I try to do other work like structuring work and editing work and all that, using other processes. But yeah, it's, getting other people to look at your work is really interesting. Getting other brains, with completely different sentence structure and completely different ways of seeing the world. Getting other people to review your work is really powerful because, diverse perspectives really do make us all smarter as well.
And we're about to wrap up here. I guess, do you have any final message for our listeners who would like to optimize their creativity when it comes to working, to understanding their brain, using their brain intentionally as a tool? Of course, I can't recommend your book enough. It's one of my favorite books ever. Anything that you would say to summarize our conversation today?
No, thanks. You've given me some momentum to finish the second edition. I'm just starting to work on a new edition to update it. We just won't change that much, but there's some new things. But I mean, I never answered the question, sort of what are the conditions for insight? And I'll say that quickly. What creates the best conditions for insight? And I wrote this in a blog called How to Have More Insights that you'll find. But it's essentially quiet is the first one, which means not thinking, not talking, just low overall activation. So quiet's the first one. Internally focused is the second one. So internally focused means you're able to like kind of vague out, like not look at the world, not hear the world, and essentially look inside yourself. It's technically known as mind wandering. You're looking inside your thoughts rather than at the outside world, right? So quiet, internally focused, slightly positive. And the reason slightly positive is important is slightly negative is generally the default, and that's noisier. So thinking about possibilities rather than problems. Thinking about, possible ways forward as opposed to why you're stuck. So slightly positive is the third one. And the fourth one is ironic, is not working directly on the impasse, like not directly trying to solve the problem you have, but working around it. So that you're not just following the same paths that you've solved, that you've failed to solve with so far. So quiet, internally focused, slightly positive, not working directly on the problem. These 4 conditions, if you can activate these in your own brain or in other people's brains as you interact, you dramatically increase the chance of insight. So that's one thing that we found. So I have written a ton of blogs on this. Your Brain at Work, obviously, there's a lot in there. I've also written a lot since then. You can find a lot of my stuff at my organization has a website with tons of my writing, and my team's writing now as well. It's NeuroLeadership.com, Neuro leadership, one word, NeuroLeadership.com. DavidRock.net has a lot as well if you're interested in some of the other things I do. So DavidRock.net. But NeuroLeadership.com has kind of everything there. And it's got the world that we do with organizations there as well, helping firms like Microsoft and lots and lots of big firms. We're actually working with about 30% of the Fortune 100 now. Helping them build more brain-based talent strategies. So we've got a team of about 200 people. So I was a startup, and now it's a kind of much more kind of intense organization. But all of that's at neuroleadership.com, and you'll see lots of blogs there that we've written on the creative space, but also on diversity and inclusion and how to have better conversations and all sorts of other spaces as well.
Great. Well, I appreciate you so much bringing up those 4 things, because I remember you mentioned those. I wrote them down, but then we ended up in a whole different neural map, I think. So I really appreciate you bringing those up. That's awesome that all those companies you're working at, it sounds like there is increasing, I guess, brain literacy happening in the corporate world, which is a good sign, I think.
Yeah.
Anything else that you'd like to add, or places that you'd like for people to find you?
No, I think just, if you're passionate about this work, just get out and start reading. It's learning about your brain is a little addictive. But we think it's a positive addiction, with similar benefits to mindfulness, actually. You're practicing observing and switching your attention as you learn more and more about your brain. So, in the same way as mindfulness, you actually get calmer and, more grounded and more centered and better immune function, all sorts of things. So get in and learn about your brain, and you'll find the whole world becomes richer. You get more control over your own life. I think your Brain at Work's a great place to start. And maybe you've encouraged me to get on with my next book. It's probably about time. But thanks for the opportunity to connect, David, and I appreciate the opportunity to share this with everyone.
David Rock, or I should say Dr. David Rock, it's been an honor talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David. Great to be with you.
Is Love Your Work helping you find your unique creative voice? Does it bring you the inspiration and motivation you need to become the creator and human you want to be? If so, please be a part of making this a special and nourishing and thoughtful show. Support the show on Patreon. You'll be an even bigger part of this show than you already are. If you contribute just a coffee a month, you'll be helping support the hosting and production of Love Your Work. Everyone has some unique creative gift to offer the world. Together, we can give people the tools they need to bring that work into the world. The world will be better off for it. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Cadavy. This is a different kind of model for supporting the work that you love. The choice is yours. Vote with your dollars, put your money where your mind is, and keep Love Your Work going. Visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/Cadavy. As a thank you, you'll get early access, bonus content, and a discount on Love Your Work merchandise. Learn more at patreon.com/Cadavy. That's patreon.com/KA, D as in David, A, V as in Victor, Y. And if you can't support the show financially, and you've listened to at least 3 episodes, can you do me a favor? Write a review on Apple Podcasts. You can consider it your donation to help support the show. Love Your Work is brought to you in part by our Patreon supporters, such as mini sponsors Roxana Maynard of Agility Alchemist at agilityalchemist.com and Paula Spriggs, and top supporters such as Jeffrey Mason and Vitas Pinkovicius. This has been Love Your Work, and I'm David Cadavy. The theme music for this show is At Sea by Dorena from the album About Everything and More by arrangement with Deep Elm Records at deepelm.com. Love Your Work is a production of Catavi Inc.